Welcome to another episode of the Drew Aversa Show. Today, I'm excited to have my guest, Dr. Dean Spitzer. Doctor, how are you?
Doing great, Drew. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to talk with you, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year as well. It's truly an honor to have you on the show. Your work, you've worked for IBM at very high levels, your degree from London School of Economics, USC, and you are an expert in measuring and the idea of valuation. How do you value things and how do you measure things? And you and I were talking at the start of the show about the election. How do you measure the election? How do you measure who's going to vote for you and all these different things? So we are in for a fun conversation today, from everything about your home in Florida to watching the awesome rockets take off and measuring success at the Kennedy Space Center nearby you, to elections, to COVID, and business in general. So,
Great.
Dr. Spitzer, I'd just love to have you introduce yourself and share a little bit about your amazing work.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, I've had about 45 years in this field, and I actually started off in human resources and realized that most of what was being done in human resources really wasn't able to improve performance. It would just kind of make people happy. It wouldn't necessarily make people productive or effective. So I moved into more of a performance focus. And so that's where I've been actually for the last 35 years or so. And, I wrote a number of books on motivation and on performance measurement. And it's interesting that I wrote that we're probably going to discuss mostly is Transforming Performance Measurement. And it's so interesting that I actually hated measurement because it was always used against me. And that's how most people feel about measurement. But when I was looking for the holy grail of human performance, I figured out that it was measurement, because what you measure is what you get. And so every organization is based on a foundation of measurement. So if the organization or the individual is measuring the wrong things, they're going to get the wrong things. So
That's
to
powerful.
me, that's powerful. Yeah.
And you and I are talking about, employee engagement. Depending on the survey you read, some say, 60% of employees globally are not engaged. We know in the US, it's very high. It's over 50%. So let's talk about that. Why are we still doing things the same way? What are we not measuring?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is we've got to understand what engagement means. And, you can have employees that are engaged, but not productive, not doing the things that the organization needs to be doing. So I've discovered that when people are successful, when they're effective, when they're doing the right things for themselves and for the organizations, they're going to be engaged. But if all we're doing is measuring and managing engagement or motivation or employee satisfaction, those are the things that we're going to get. And I maintain that engagement and satisfaction are not necessarily highly correlated with productivity. And to me, that's what's important. I've never met somebody who wasn't productive, who was not satisfied and engaged. But I've met lots of people who are satisfied but not productive. So to me, I focus more on performance rather than on, the same thing's true with customers. If you measure customer satisfaction, what are you going to get? You're going to get maybe somebody who buys a product once. But if you focus on customer value and increasing that value to customers, then you're going to get customers who are going to continue to buy and are going to be very loyal to your organization. So again, what you measure is what you get, so you better make sure you're measuring the right things. And there's no easy answer to it. It's a matter of thinking about, what should I measure? And is this the right thing to measure? So I've found that probably the most important thing we can do is to get people to ask the right questions about measurement. And the key question that we need to ask over and over again is, are we measuring and therefore managing the right thing?
And something we talked about earlier was the challenges, right now with COVID, right? For example, we're seeing people either underreporting certain things, overreporting certain things. The media causes a ton of fear with people. Obviously, the situation is not great. We both know that. However, we know with data in certain things that you can use data in a powerful way, where if you are asking the right question and you are truly open to the right answer with the data and humble enough to accept whatever the data, the true data is sharing with you, you can make good decisions. But there's also this other thing of some leaders, for example, want certain outcomes, and then they will paint the picture of data to shape that outcome, even though that could be detrimental to the organization long term. So can we talk about that data and measuring, and how do you measure and how do you work with a leader who is dead set on, I want to measure this, but I want to see this as the outcome, right? As opposed to, I need to hear this as the truth to have a better outcome.
That's a great point. As we were talking about earlier, you can prove anything you want to prove using data. I mean, you just select the data that proves what you want. In a courtroom, there's the presentation of data, and you listen to the defense attorney and you think that every defendant is innocent, and then you listen to the prosecutor and you think that everybody's guilty. So, that's, I think, so important. Now, in my book, Transforming Performance Measurement, I talk about the 4 keys to making measurement and management successful. The first one is focus. You got to focus on the right things. And there are so many things that you can focus on. And the key is to ask the right questions. What is most important to my effectiveness and the effectiveness of the organization? The second thing is integration. Every organization is a combination of lots of different parts. And so we got to make sure that we're focused on the right things and those things are integrated. One thing I found is in organizations, there are maybe 20 or 30 different functions. Each of those functions has their own measurement system. If you go to the finance people, you get one set of measures. The customer service people, another set of measures. The operations people, the shipping and receiving people, the IT people. Everybody has their own measurement system. And in most organizations, those measures are totally unrelated to each other. There's really no integration of the measurement system. And that causes lots of problems that we'll discuss in a minute. And then there's interactivity. To me, one of the most important things in measurement is the conversations that should go on around interpreting the data. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is, how do you get data to become information? Because data is just isolated points of usually numbers. And then what happens is you can put those numbers into some meaningful form, such as in a graph, and then it becomes information. But even information is not too high a level. You've got to get that information into knowledge. Knowledge is information that's actionable. And even that isn't that great, because what you really want is you want wisdom. So what you need is a lot of experience with that knowledge to turn it into wisdom. We talk a lot about the wisdom in the Bible, for instance. And unfortunately, you can read the Bible and the wisdom in the Bible, book of Proverbs and all those, and Solomon and stuff like that. And you're not going to become wise unless you put it into practice. So
absolutely. And I always share with people nowadays, all the problems, and I've read every religious text out there, from, the Bible, our shared faith, to Buddhism, to Islam. And we're repeating the same issues over and over again. Change the outfit, change the clothing, change the government name, whatever. We're still seeing tax challenges with, human destruction onto other people, business issues, the plague, the virus now, all these things. So it's a cycle, as you say, in the wisdom piece. I agree with you, that's the highest piece of life. And when you can harness that, it's powerful. So how do you operate, though, in a world where you are wise, and then you have a lot of people around that aren't? They're still going through the hamster wheel.
Okay, well, The first thing you got to realize is that data isn't wisdom. Information isn't wisdom. So we talk a lot today and we hear, people chagrined about misinformation. And the fact remains is all information is going to be misinformation until you use it properly. So what you've got to do is take that isolated data and information and put it into some kind of framework. We call that a theory or a set of hypotheses. Then we test that theory and hypotheses, and from that we come up with knowledge. And then we use that knowledge for a while and we have conversations about it, we interact about it, and then gradually that becomes wisdom. The problem that we have today that we've been discussing is that we are fixated on data and information out of context. So as I said, in a courtroom, you can prove anything. You can prove somebody innocent, you can prove somebody guilty, and it's up to the judge or the jury to determine what the real truth is. So the jury is real and the judge is really the source of knowledge and wisdom. And to me, that's key. That causing all of our problems is that we really don't have anybody judging the truthfulness of the data and information. So everybody's coming up, and you mentioned the COVID situation. So we have everybody with their theory, but very few of those theories are ever tested and proven. And so we don't really know what is truth, because truth is when we take that information and turn it into knowledge and wisdom. So in my book, I talk about interactivity as being the factor that where people carry on intelligent conversations to determine what the truth is. And that's got to occur interactively and iteratively over time. And then the fourth factor is context. If we don't want to know the truth, and if we don't like measurement, then we're going to have a difficult time using it. And I believe that one of the biggest problems that we have in the measurement and management arena is that people don't like measurement. It's been used against them all their lives, in their families, in their schools, in their workplaces. One of the examples I constantly refer to in the book is performance appraisal. W. Edwards Deming called performance appraisal one of the deadly sins of management. All of us have been victims of performance appraisal. And that's an example of measurement that could be very beneficial, but it's used very negatively against people.
I agree with you. And I think going back to your wisdom piece on performance evaluation, right, is if you are wise in a sense, right, and then you are taking a job, because we know the reality is certain times you need a job in life. You may not be in the ideal position, just based on life circumstance and bills and the reality of the world. So then you're being measured or you're being evaluated by somebody who may not be wise. They may not be kind, in spirit, and they may not be productive in doing things. So that creates a very interesting situation. How can managers be mindful and be accurate in measuring somebody's performance when maybe that manager's actually not the best manager to begin with? We see that. We see people leave managers, right? We know the data on that too. So we have this performance evaluation system where people are literally being judged, measured by other people that may not be, up to snuff in a sense.
Yeah, well, there are two things that I mentioned about that, or a lot of things. But first of all, we talked about the courtroom situation. And so in most cases, the manager is the prosecutor. And, there really isn't any objective information because the manager is coming up with that information. Also, that information may not be accurate. There's one piece of research that's really fascinating that found that performance appraisals are more closely correlated with the personality of the manager doing the appraisal than the employee himself or herself. It tends to, the quality of the performance appraisal tends to have an awful lot to do with the personality of the person doing the appraisal. And that's why, in a courtroom, you don't want a courtroom with just a prosecutor. And I guess, if you're the citizenry, you don't want a courtroom that just has the defense attorney.
So does that take us into the 360-degree evaluation, the peer-driven evaluation? Is that where we're getting to then? where,
Well,
you know,
to some
the
extent,
one-on-ones are one-on-ones, right? Where they're
well,
highly subjective. And then we have the next thing in corporate, which are these 360s where you're reviewed by your peers.
yeah, but let me tell you what happened at IBM when that happened. We had 360 measurement. What happened is we all got together with our peers and we all made a deal that we were going to rate each other highly. You know, you scratch my back, and
Survivor
that's what
101.
happens. You know, so peer assessment doesn't necessarily work very well. I mean, in theory, 360 measurement sounds like a good idea because what you're doing is you're getting the perspective of different stakeholders. And that in essence is good. But if the data is very subjective and poor data, then you're going to have a problem. Now, one of the things I talk about in the book that's fascinating is the difference between measurement and evaluation. Do you know the difference between the two?
I would love to hear it.
Okay. The word evaluation, if you decompose it, it is valuation, to place a value judgment on. So what we do is we place value judgments on people, but underlying those value judgments is not good measurement. So if you look at the measurement that underlies those assessments, it's not good.
You
So
know,
to
and
me,
let's take that into our faith principle too a little bit, because, you know, I mean, here we are literally, it sounds like a piece of machinery, right? And that's the problem with human resources, just by definition, is that we treat people like this cog in the wheel. And at the end of the day, there's still the soul, there's still the spirit of the person. So we've talked about one, there's this highly subjective measurement, the courtroom measurement in a sense, with the one-on-one, right? Where the manager is, you know, evaluating somebody and there's no opportunity to counter. And we know that for employees, the counter really is a signature. You either agree with this or you can write a quick statement that you don't agree with it. That's the evaluation. Then we're talking about the 360, where it sounds a little bit better in theory, but you just mentioned that it's like Survivor Island, where you're making pacts with people to have a good evaluation to keep your job. And so how do we look
not
at
only
it?
that, but the measurement that's being used is so subjective. So what I think is so important is that you've got to understand that evaluations or assessments are okay, but they have to be based on a foundation of good measurement. So we've got to look at the measurement that those evaluations are being based on. Now, one of the things that I feel very strongly about is there are two types of measurement. The one is the traditional measurement, which is things like monitoring, reporting, control, justifying, judging, and triggering rewards and punishment, and what I call negative accountability. You know, those are that's what we tend to use measurement for, and that's one of the reasons why people are so defensive about measurement. Now, there's another type of measurement, which I call positive measurement, which uses measurement to increase visibility, to improve communication, to enhance feedback, to promote understanding, to help us predict the future, to learn, improve, and to promote positive or self-accountability. So
Dr.
to me,
Spitzer, that sounds like the one that I would want to have in my company if I'm
exactly.
running the company, right?
Exactly. And almost no organizations have that type of measurement. It's all the negative type of measurement, the traditional type of measurement. And so I think that, you know, that's that fourth factor that I talk about in the book, you know, the focus, the integration, the interactivity, and the context. So the context of measurement needs to be positive if people are going to use it well and learn from it, because the purpose of measurement should be learning and improvement. It shouldn't be monitoring and control.
I agree with you 110%, 1,000%. And what fascinates me is you and I both traveled around the world. Let's talk about ideology. How did we get here? How did we get to this state today when there are two clear paths, right? There's the path of control, there's the path of negativity, there's a path of pain and punishment, which we see where, you know, the healthcare outcomes in the US, we're a very stressful nation, right? We see that, you know, leading into the disease processes, all these things are interconnected. You talked about interactivity, integration, you know, we're all interconnected as a species, as a biological being, as a human, you know, in the workplace. So one input creates another thing and all that. How did we get here? How did we get to be this punitive, negative thing? And then how do we get to be a culture of, yes, a culture of innovation, a culture of I have your back and you're doing great. And, the world's changing right now. The world's changing so much where the 40-hour work week, that may be a thing of the past and it may not be that far out.
But you know what's so interesting is you mentioned the subject of engagement. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to create employee engagement in a negative context. So we're often giving people all these benefits and nice things, but we do it in a context that's already so negative, that has so many of those things that I talked about built into the culture. So, when we have things like an environment that's about monitoring, controlling, reporting, and triggering rewards and punishments, even rewards are manipulative in their very basic nature. And so what we need is a culture where people want to learn and improve. And if we can create that. And so in my book, Super Motivation, which I wrote many, many years ago, that's what I talk about, is how to create a positive climate in organizations rather than come up with the employee program of the month type of club. And, so to me, that's the key. Now, going back to theology, and you were the one that mentioned the theology, Drew, but it is interesting if you look at biblical history. What happened? In the Garden of Eden.
And just to let everybody know, we're not preaching religion, right? We're not. But we're talking about historical context. Before the courtroom was the courtroom, religion was the law of the land. It was the way things were structured.
That's right. And it was a reward and punishment sort of situation, where, Adam and Eve were told that they could eat from any of the trees, and they ate from the wrong thing and they got punished.
They screwed that one up, didn't they, Dr. Spitzer?
Yeah, they sure did. And then there was the 10 Commandments, and in Judaism there are actually 613 commandments. So everything is do this, don't do this. But when Jesus came around, he had a more positive approach. And, he wasn't about the law. He was about helping his disciples learn and improve. And he created a culture that we really should model our current organizational cultures after, which is about learning and improvement, becoming all the people that God wants us to be. And so,
that's a powerful statement, though. Let's look at that for just 1 second, because,
Sure.
If you think about how many people call themselves Christian, right? Through his action, through his care, through the way that he flipped the narrative from this hateful God into the loving God. Because if you read the Old Testament, God was angry, man. I mean, he was about ready to be done. I mean, he gave Noah that final chance of like, hey, go on this ark, don't come out. And then what did Noah do? He came out, right? And then next thing it's like, you people are just idiots, all right, I still love you, but okay, you're going to have some pain and suffering. And then comes along this other guy, the Son of God, through the story of Jesus. And then there's this hope, there's this healing, there's this different way of being. And I think that is very powerful when we look at leadership, because we see that in America, 60% of Americans identify themselves as Christian, right, but yet we're not leading that way in our own businesses.
That's correct. Exactly. So that's a fantastic model. But I mean, historically, that's what happened, is that most religion has been very punitive, and Christianity, at least, purports to be a religion that is about learning and improvement and getting people to not be focused on the letter of the law, but with the spirit of what God wants. And see, that's part of the problem, is that in organizations, we tend to focus on the rules, on the letter. We were talking about customers. What happens is an organization comes up with a metric, for instance, such as customer satisfaction or customer loyalty or something like that. And then everybody has to follow that mantra, that metric, and they blindly follow. What there should happen is the organization should have a conversation about what's really important. And that brings us to that subject that you brought up at the beginning, our conversation, is value. To me, organizations should be entirely about value creation, and they should be asking questions about how do we maximize value for all of our stakeholders. So if we focus, for instance, on customer satisfaction as our primary metric, as well as I do, that focuses on a transaction. What we have, somebody goes to a hotel or flies on an airplane and they get a customer satisfaction survey. By the way, people hate customer satisfaction surveys. When you receive a customer satisfaction survey, how do you respond to it? Are you happy about it?
No, and by the way, what I also hate are pop-ups on your website. So seriously, like if you're trying to stop the pop-up thing, when you go to 10, 20 websites a day, that's an old strategy when not a lot of people are on the web. And now it's a horrible way to show your value. I'm with you.
Right. But the point is that we ought to really understand what brings long-term value to our customer. And, I get probably in an average week, maybe 10 or 15 customer satisfaction surveys that basically say nothing. They're about the organization trying to confirm their operating hypothesis, which is we're great. And we want you to tell us how great we are. And if you tell them that there's something wrong, then of course you get punished because you're asked 5 more questions about that thing that you said was bad.
Absolutely. And that goes back to what you and I are talking about, because as consultants, a lot of the time, we get brought in to solve challenges, and doing so in diplomatic ways where you're saying, your culture has some gaps, or the way you're measuring things are not the most accurate to have a better outcome. And do you even want a better outcome? Because a lot of people want the status quo. So how do we get to be an innovative company with the disruption today? Is measurement and value creation a key to that?
Well, for one thing, you want to make sure that the measurement you're doing is really adding value. So it's incredible that, we measure things in organizations, but we never ask the employees, are we measuring the right things? Because if you asked employees if we were measuring the right things and employees were honest, they would say, absolutely not. These metrics are causing us to do dysfunctional things. And I have a lot in the book about measurement dysfunction, which I'm sure you could write a book on that subject as well. But the point is that we need to have difficult conversations about what we should be measuring and what we should be managing. We talked earlier about politics. And I mentioned that I believe one of the biggest problems in elections is that the candidates measure what they think is important, not what is really important to the electorate. You remember I mentioned to you that
you mentioned Donald Trump. Let's talk about it. I mean, let's just get juicy.
I love Donald Trump, but he made a big mistake as he measured his success by the number of people who were enthusiastic at his rallies. And of course, if you get the customers that are the most enthusiastic ones about you and you ask them some questions, they're going to give you enthusiastic, positive responses. But that's not going to be accurate measurement. So what you want to measure is the independent, the undecided people. Those are the most important people. Those are the people that Donald Trump and any other political candidate needs to win over, not the core supporters, but the people who are on the fence. And the same thing's true with a product. You could be selling a product very effectively and successfully for a while, but after a while, you might run out those early adopter type of customers. And then you need customers who are probably not as enthusiastic about your product or your service. So what you need to do is you need to measure the whole range of your stakeholders, of the people you're out to get, not just the people who are enthusiastic supporters, because that's going to give you a very, very unrealistic view. One thing that was really interesting in the polling, if you remember, Drew, Biden was polling about 5 points or more ahead of Trump. And that was pretty much across the board. So, if I was running that campaign, I would be very concerned about that. And I would want to find out not how enthusiastic the people who support me are, but how can I win over the people who are not enthusiastic about my candidacy.
Absolutely. And you and I were talking about things. It's funny because some people are just so short-sighted, right? So we know the data is there. Take, for example, student loan debt. Student loan debt is massive. You can go to Europe, you can get an education there for free or nearly free, PhDs from great universities. And then we come here and then people are, you know, 50, 100, $200,000 in debt for a similar degree, similar theory, right?
Right.
And from there, you take that example and you say, look, everybody knows we need to get rid of student loan debt. So if Biden comes in and he gives the 10,000, or if they do the 50,000, Trump could have easily gotten a whole new base of young millennials and Gen Zers with student loan debt for $10,000. They're sending a $2,000 check to people. They're trying to think about what they're going to do with that. But for that example, you would have a whole new customer because now you just created a new set of value, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, that's the key, is we've got to focus on the value of the people that we're selling to, whether it be a constituency in a political campaign, or whether it be, you know, customers for a business or a government agency or whatever, or a religious organization. You know, I constantly, and I'm sure you do as well, I get so many charitable solicitations, and we are very, very generous. But after a while, it just gets so sickening, because what happens is, by doing good, we get punished. So if we give to a new charity, we constantly get inundated with their solicitations, which is a negative. So what is one of the things that organizations ought to be measuring? It should be measuring the reactions of people to their communications. So the thing that organizations should do in that respect is they should find out how their customers want to be communicated with. And that would solve the problem. So if you're basically, Drew, what it comes down to, you got to ask the right questions, and then you're going to get the right answers.
So
But
let's
if you
let's
ask
talk
the
about
wrong
this.
questions, you're going to invariably get the wrong answers.
Okay, Dr. Spitzer. So let's just say we asked the right questions. All right. For going back to Trump, I just politics is fun because it's one of those things everybody's like, you should not talk about that. No, we should, because there are a lot of great learning examples. So in this example, right, we know that the student loan debt is going to cripple this country eventually. Like, it will either keep us as a first world nation if we can figure out a way to solve this, because net income is something that everybody values. Everybody values a positive net income. Everybody values the ability to retire with dignity, to not have to work, you know, at Home Depot when you're 70 years old. And, you know, it just, as a first world nation with so much wealth, we should have better systems in place, I think, long term. So when we look at in the example of value, right? Let's say the Republican Party said, okay, we're going to give $10,000 for student loans. They accelerate that. But what we're talking about too is humans' resistance to change. Because if you have the right knowledge, the knowledge is there. This is a big problem. The knowledge is there that healthcare is so expensive in this country. It's rising every year. I get a new thing. Oh, your healthcare premium went up 3-4%. Why should my healthcare be going up? You know, I've been treated in different hospitals for food poisoning, different things around the world, and it's very affordable. It's truly affordable healthcare. America, it's not affordable healthcare. It's mandated healthcare, but it's not affordable. So how do we change these sort of things where we have the knowledge, right? We have I say America's problems, all of our problems could be solved tomorrow if we had the right mindset, if we had the right will. So why are we so resistant to change, and how can we accelerate change to see better outcomes in our lifetime?
Well, I think one of the problems you're demonstrating yourself is by focusing on some of the answers before we understand what the problem is. So the problem is not student loan debt. The problem isn't the cost of medical care. You know, those are symptoms of a much larger problem. You could say that, you know, the major symptom of all the problems is we have a spiraling debt that's out of control, and a deficit that's, you know, gonna absolutely destroy any financial security for future generations. So what I would be asking is, what are the core problems? But that's what happens. You know, politicians don't ask that question because they're always looking to the next election. You know, the House of Representatives is gets reelected every 2 years, the Senate every 6 years, the president every 4 years. So we never had the will to deal with the root cause problems. So for instance, you mentioned healthcare. The problem isn't the cost of healthcare. The problem is we are developing a country of unhealthy people. So if we want to solve that problem, we've got to measure health, not the cost of healthcare. And the same thing's true with student debt. The problem isn't student debt. The problem is more we're creating people who with the wrong skill set. And so what is the skill set we're going to need for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years? Those are not the questions that we're asking. We're focused on the surface symptoms. We're not focused on the root cause. So that's why I say it's so important to ask the right questions. And I'm not saying that I'm asking the right questions. I'm trying to get us to ask the right questions, which are deeper, more profound, more seminal than the questions that we're asking right now. And then going back to the customer, the key question to ask about the customer is simply, what value does our customer group want? And to really find out what they value. And the same thing's true if you're starting a church. I want to find out, what people value, so I can provide that value to them, of course, within certain theological constraints. And with a politician, how can I provide maximum value to my constituents? Not how do I just get people to show up at a polling place not knowing what they're really voting for. And unfortunately, that's what we're finding. And today happens to be the day that Georgia is voting in the Senate runoff. And most of the people don't have a clue about what they're voting for. They're voting for a party, or they're voting against something rather than for something.
Oh, absolutely. I think the judges' elections are always the most interesting because people are voting just for a name. And nobody asks the judge, what are your positions on these things? How are you going to change some of these systemic issues, but yet it's the law. And then we see it takes forever to change the rule of law on certain things until there is different measurement or a different value created, in a sense, for the cannabis industry. It took years and years until the right people had their seat at the table to change that, to make it legal, to profit from it, and to make it valuable for them. But we saw what that did to the African-American community in this country, with so many young men in jail because they were trying to survive during a time when, there wasn't value for the cannabis industry, or taking their skill set into, a career of legalized medicinal marijuana like we have today, where I always say, hire the ex-felons for your cannabis industry. They know the product extremely well. They'll be the most valuable salesperson you'll have.
But going back to those 4 factors that I talk about in my book, Transforming Performance Measurement, the most important thing is if we're going to manage the right things, whether it be on a countrywide basis or within an industry or with a company or with any organization, we've got to measure the right things if we're going to manage the right things. And then we cannot measure and manage individual things because everything is interrelated these days. So we've got to make sure that what we're measuring is integrated. If we're going to run a company where everybody's going in the same direction, we've got to make sure that there are some cross-functional measures. Now, one of the examples that I use in the book that I think is a great example is Southwest Airlines. Many, many years ago, they came up with a metric called turnaround time. How fast could they turn the planes around? Now, with COVID and stuff like that, it's sort of gotten in the way of their turnaround time. But remember, back many years ago, it was taking about an hour and a half, the time that a flight lands to a time when that flight could take off again. And Southwest Airlines reduced it to 20 minutes. And how did they do that? By getting everybody focused on that one cross-functional metric, which is turnaround time. And I don't know if you remember this, but I sure do, is that they, the pilots, the co-pilots, the flight attendants, everybody and the the ground crew were all working together amazingly well to turn those planes around.
That's the key. You said amazingly well, because everybody was smiling. And I always say that you can't fake the smiles, and you get on other airlines and they're trying to turn things around. You're like, oh boy, I do not want to talk to the flight crew today at all. Like, hopefully this plane lands.
That's a good point. Is Southwest Airlines not only had the metric turnaround time, but they also focused on their symbol for the stock market symbol is love. And they focused a lot on satisfying the customer, making the customer feel good, having a positive customer experience. So yeah, you're absolutely right. But by focusing on those two things, they were able to grow that airline into the most successful airline in the history of the world, because they were doing things that brought people together and they were providing the right value to the customer. And then the other thing is interactivity, is that we've got to have people asking the right questions about what the most crucial issues are, because otherwise you're not going to figure out what you should be measuring and managing. And people won't understand what the data means, and they won't be able to drive the data to information, to knowledge and wisdom. And then the final factor is context. You've got to create a context in which people want to do those things. They want to measure. They want to come up with the right answers. So you can't use measurement punitively against them. You've got to have positive measurement rather than negative measurement.
I love it, Dr. Spitzer. And what companies out there today are doing?
I was hoping you wouldn't ask that question, because I really don't have any good examples to give you.
Everybody step it up. You heard it from Dr. Spitzer.
Southwest
Airlines. All right. Even though the planes aren't flying like they used to, but hopefully everything will get back.
They're still doing very well.
Yeah, they definitely are. Any industries that you would say do better than others on things, or is this a universal challenge?
This is a universal challenge. And, I wrote my book, Transforming Performance Measurement, a little over 10 years ago. And I'll tell you, there hasn't been a whole lot that's changed since then, unfortunately. And I think the reason is because companies don't really understand the importance of measurement or value it. They don't realize how it's destroying their companies. One of the things I talk about in the book is using measurement technology. Companies are spending tens of millions of dollars on dashboards and all kinds of measurement technology and data mining and things like that. But once they come up with these insights, the employees don't know what to do with them. So there's that that whole contextual missing link.
I found that true, because you were talking, because the challenge is you're talking about shifting. You're talking about shifting old paradigm into something new. And the hard part is when you're an employee, if you're an innovative employee, right, an entrepreneurial employee, I just look back at when I was recruited into Fortune 500 companies, it was always, oh, you're entrepreneurial, this and that. But those companies don't move at the speed at which entrepreneurs want to move, nor do they handle the constructive criticism well when you're sharing things of, hey, if we want to evolve, we should explore XYZ or consider these things or talk to these people. And I always, got down to the field level with people. I would always, go to the lowest level, right, in a sense, because that's where I started in the fire service. And I learned so much the importance of things where you can't be overseeing something at a 30,000 foot level and not know how the fire engine works, right? Or not know how to get water out of it. And then if there's an issue, how do you take care of the troops that are doing things? And I think that's where a lot of leadership today is very disconnected and not out there with their people and not really seeing what's going on. So can people, if they want to create a better organization, what are some steps that they can take, just some actionable things as leaders to start having those courageous conversations, to not putting people on the fire list for speaking too passionately about change, and giving them a bad evaluation, even though that person might be the best person in your entire company, to drive change in a disruptive environment that we're in today. So what's your advice for, CEOs and senior managers and leaders?
Well, the most important thing is to change the context in which measurement and management is used. And the proper context is a positive context that's focused on learning and improvement. And if organizations were dedicated to learning and improvement, that paradigm shift would happen almost instantaneously. And the other thing is, going back to my point, you've got to have that dialogue about what should we be measuring and managing, not the 100 or 1,000 things, but what are the 1, 2, or 3 things that we should be focused on? What are the core issues that are most important? And then we've got to make sure that people are working together to do that integration. And then we've got to make sure that that people are having those intelligent conversations that are bringing the data to information, the information to knowledge, and then the knowledge to wisdom.
Dr. Dean Spitzer.
It's very difficult to do, but I do have blueprints in my book that talk about how to do it. It's very difficult to put it into a sentence or two.
We could talk for hours on this subject, and it is just a pleasure having you on the show today. How can people get in touch with you, LinkedIn with you, and read your book?
Book's available on Amazon. I'm on LinkedIn. They're welcome to contact me if they like, and we can have some great dialogues.
Dr. Dean Spitzer, the man, the myth, the legend, the expert on measurement and valuation. Great to have you on the show today.
Thank you so much, Drew. It's great being with you. And again, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year as well.
And hopefully in the new year, we'll learn how to do these things better.
Absolutely. I say don't bring the 2020 into 2021. Make 2021 the year of innovation, revolution, and in your words, measuring and creating tremendous value.
And measuring the right things.
Measuring the right things, not the wrong things, and having courageous conversations to do so, knowing that it's okay to have those conversations today. And
Amen.
Don't fire people if they don't agree with you.
No, you should promote them, because those are the people who are going to be most valuable in helping you improve the organization.
Love the final gold nugget.